With the 5060 Ti rumored to have an 8GB version as well as a 16GB version, discussions of 8GB of VRAM are heating up again. And so what is the truth? Some people claim that at 1080p it's fine. Some people say that it's a disaster. Some people say just turn down graphic settings a little bit and it's okay. So we're going to test all of that in this video. We're testing 1080p and 1440p, and in each game we test, we will test high or nearly max settings as well as lower settings. Here in Indiana Jones and the Great Circle at 1080p Supreme, which is the highest non-path tracing setting, an 8GB card crashes while a 16GB version of the same card runs just fine. What if you turn down to medium settings though? Because this is oftentimes the argument about 8GB cards are fine. If you're playing at 1080p at like medium settings, it's not an issue. Well, actually notice here that the 4060 Ti 16GB version is noticeably faster than the 8GB version, even at 1080p medium in this title. And that's really important to note, is that the 4060 Ti 8GB and 16GB version perform identically other than when you spill over 8GB of VRAM capacity. Now, moving up to 1440p at medium settings, again, we see the same thing, where the 16GB version of the 4060 Ti is very noticeably outperforming the 8GB version. And it's especially important to look at things like the frame time graph, where we're seeing these intermittent spikes on the 8GB card and not seeing that on the 16GB card, leading to worse 1% lows. So oftentimes, the biggest difference shows up in stutters in the 1% lows. Also, it can be missing textures and things like that. It really depends on the game. Like I said, some games just crash. Moving at 1440p back up to Supreme, which again is not even the max settings in the game, it's the max non-path tracing settings though, the 4060 Ti 16GB is running just fine, averaging about 66 FPS in this demanding jungle scenes, and even the 1% lows around 60 FPS. Indiana Jones and the Great Circle is actually very well optimized. You get these nice flat frame time graphs and everything as long as you have enough VRAM. And again, we're seeing that an issue on the 8GB card here. But is this just one title that's particularly VRAM heavy? Well, there are others. Final Fantasy XVI, again, people who say that if you're playing at 1080p, 8GB of VRAM is not an issue. We'll try playing Final Fantasy XVI. Here at 1080p Ultra, we can see a noticeable difference in the averages. Again, these cards will average identical when VRAM is not an issue at 51 versus 59, but the bigger issue is in the 1% lows right here. Do you see the massive spikes on the frame time graph as well on the 8GB card? It's a stuttery mess, very noticeable stutters on the 8GB card that you're not seeing on the 16GB card. Even turning down to medium settings still has these big frame time spikes and a massive difference in 1% lows and a difference in the averages. So even at 1080p medium settings in yet another game, we're seeing issues for the 8GB VRAM card. So again, the argument that games are fine at 1080p on 8GB, or if you turn down graphic settings off of Ultra, you're completely fine, simply isn't true in all the games that are out there now. I also want to mention that I did not particularly choose this sample of games to stress 8GB of VRAM. If you've watched all of my other various GPU comparison videos, this is just my standard benchmark suite that I've been using for this year ever since the 50 series launched. So I am not going out of my way to make 8GB of VRAM here look bad. I am just using the set of games that I test, and I'm even turning down to medium settings. Again, 1440p Ultra was a disaster, but so is 1440p medium. That's the thing here, right? There are definitely games where even turning down to reasonable graphic settings are still having problems. Here we can see the big spikes in the frame time graph on the 8GB card, whereas the 16GB card is running smoothly with the 1% lows at 26 on the 8GB card versus 44 on the 16GB card. And again, some people argue that, okay, but you know, these aren't settings that are getting like super high frame rates or anything anyway, or use DLSS. That lowers the VRAM usage anyway because you're lowering the internal rendering resolution. Well, here's 1440p medium using DLSS quality. We can see that the card with enough VRAM is averaging 76 FPS, and even the 8GB card is averaging 63. But notice those spikes in the frame time graph. Those extremely noticeable stutters are still there, and the 1% lows on the 8GB card are down at 21, only reaching 35% of the 1% lows as the 4060 Ti. Let's look at some more games. This is Horizon Forbidden West, and once again, at 1080p resolution, we are seeing some signs of VRAM issues because these cards would perform identically if the difference is not caused by VRAM. we can see a measurable difference in the averages and the 1% lows. And again, this is only at 1080p, and these are settings and frame rates where the card that has enough VRAM is doing just fine. However, another thing I should note about measuring VRAM in benchmark tests like this is a lot of times the worst things you see with VRAM-related issues happen over long duration tests. So these are like little 1-minute benchmark runs, and I'm already seeing issues. The issues tend to be worse if you run the game longer. Now, dropping down to medium settings does seem to mostly solve the problem. The averages are now margin of error. We can see 109 FPS versus 110. The 1% lows, though, it is still, it's 51 FPS versus 54. That's not absolutely massive, but it does mean the 4060 Ti 8GB is 6% slower than the 16GB card. And again, I'm curious if running a longer duration test would see any additional issues. But let's go ahead and move up to 1440p. So at 1440p, very high settings, again, we can see measurably slower results on the 8GB card compared to the 16GB, even if it's not as disastrous in the first couple of games we looked at. Using DLSS, interestingly, seems to make the results worse. The cards are faster now, but it looks like the card with enough VRAM is able to scale further ahead, whereas the card that's spilling into across system memory doesn't seem to be able to boost as much from using DLSS as the card that did have enough VRAM. So I guess it kind of makes sense in that sense. Now again, turning down to medium settings does get them matched average FPS. The 1% lows are still a little bit worse on the 8GB card, but not super disastrously so. I mean, there is some margin of error in testing as well. But anyway, so this seems to be a game where mostly turning down to medium settings does seem to mostly solve the problem, and using DLSS on the medium settings, both cards do seem to be giving a pretty good experience here. Let's go ahead and move on. Now, when we're talking about NVIDIA cards in particular, you're often, think about the NVIDIA feature set. What about path tracing? Well, here, I mean, these cards just aren't really good enough for path tracing, at least particularly well. But you can see that 1080p RT overdrive in Cyberpunk is showing, especially in the 1% lows, that the 8GB card is 13% slower. And if you look at the frame time graph, that's where you really see it. Do you see those big stutters in the frame time graph? That's the best place to find the VRAM issues in this test. But again, it is true that neither of these cards are fast enough for this. Again, we're kind of using these as stand-ins for the 5060 Ti, though, which should be faster than these, although maybe not enough to make these settings super playable. We'll have to find out. But what about using DLSS? The new transformer model looks quite good, even at 1080p quality, so let's use 1080p quality with the new DLSS 4 transformer model. Note, I'm not enabling frame gen at this point. And you can see that the 16GB card is now, around 50 FPS. The 8GB card is at 48. But again, look at the frame time graph. You're getting these more noticeable spikes in the frame time graph that corresponds to stutters that you would notice in person. Again, you can see lower 1% lows as well. It's really important in a video like this, though, because I always see comments about this. Don't judge whether there's stutters by the video capture that you're seeing. The capture is not in sync with the YouTube video you're watching, which is at a fixed 60 FPS with no variable refresh rate. That's why the frame time graphs are here, to try to get you an idea of when there are stutters. Anyway, now we could look at frame generation, but I did turn off the frame time graphs for these ones because the tools I'm using here do not seem to report the frame time graphs correctly with the latest version of DLSS frame generation. That being said, you will notice that the 1% lows are significantly worse on the 8GB card here, and both are being measured the same way. So again, it's likely that we're seeing those stutters happening due to the lower VRAM capacity. Anyway, what if we moved up to 1440p and tried to use upscaling to get reasonable frame rates? Well, honestly, even going down to balanced mode upscaling, the frame rates aren't great, but you can certainly see an issue in the 1% lows and the averages for the 8GB card compared to the 16GB card. Again, for these two particular cards, I would say these aren't realistic settings, but again, we're talking about yet another generation coming out where the 5060 Ti is rumored to have an 8GB version. So you have more power. Settings like this might be more playable unless you don't have enough VRAM, and it seems like at least one version of the card probably won't. But there are tons of games that run absolutely fine on 8GB of VRAM, and we don't see any measurable difference even at the maximum settings. Looking here at God of War Ragnarok, we can see that the 8GB and 16GB cards perform virtually identically, both of them averaging around 70 FPS at 1080p Ultra with similar 1% lows. 1080p medium, frame rates go up, but performance for both of them stays about the same. 1440p Ultra, identical performance on the 8 and 16GB cards. So again, at least in the minute or so long testing that I'm doing here, not seeing any signs that 8GB of VRAM is an issue in this game at 1080p or 1440p. Again, you could even kick on DLSS for higher frame rates. And you could drop down to medium settings as well. And again, I'm seeing about identical performance on the 8 and 16GB card here. Using DLSS quality on the medium settings, again, gets you nice high frame rates, and the 8 and 16GB cards are performing about the same. So definitely games where it doesn't matter too much. Let's switch into some Unreal Engine 5 testing. This is Silent Hill 2 at 1080p epic settings with hardware ray tracing turned on. And as far as I can measure in this area of the game, at least, I don't see any sign that 8GB of VRAM is an issue. Both cards have identical performance. If we drop down to medium settings, they still have pretty much identical performance. Remember, 1 FPS difference, 1% difference or so. There's just run-to-run variance. And these aren't physically the same graphics card either. But again, the only specs difference is the 8 versus 16GB of VRAM. At 1440p epic settings with RT on, though, now we see a noticeable difference in the 1% lows, where the 4060 Ti 8GB is about 19% slower, and the averages are a bit lower as well. Now, those are settings that are maybe not too appropriate to these cards, although using DLSS does get it into maybe playable range, given that this is a very slow-paced game. And it also means that I'm also seeing less of an issue on the 8GB card once we've used DLSS quality, indicating that my lower rendering resolution might have got it to where that's causing fewer problems. Although, again, sometimes longer playtest does reveal a bit more issues here. 1440p medium settings, now I'm seeing the cards, again, performing pretty much identically. No noticeable difference between the 8 and 16GB card. So here medium settings do just fine. Kick on DLSS quality to get a higher frame rate, and again, the 8GB card is hanging in there just fine along with the 16GB counterpart. Let's look at another Unreal Engine 5 game. This is Hellblade II Senua's Saga. This game does not have hardware ray tracing available, and high is the highest setting available in the game. There's nothing beyond that. And again, the 8 and 16GB cards are performing similarly here. There's a small difference between the two, and I will say that in this minute-long benchmark run that I did, I'm not seeing issues here, but I have seen in longer playthroughs, the 8GB cards start to struggle at the high settings. So I think this is a game where a longer playthrough can find sections of the game that are problematic on max settings on 8GB. If we move to the medium settings, again, we see a little bit of a measurable difference in the 1% lows. Again, Unreal Engine 5 can just be a bit stuttery, so sometimes there's a bit of run-to-run variance there in the 1% lows just due to that as well. If we move up to 1440p high settings, now we're seeing, again, especially in the 1% lows, a more noticeable difference, right? Now we're seeing the 8GB card only reaching 91% of the performance of the 16GB card, indicating that it's possible there's a little more going on there than it just not being a VRAM-related issue. And again, in longer playthroughs, I have seen bigger issues on the 8GB card at those settings. Using DLSS can get both cards to around 60 FPS. And again, the 8GB card is mostly hanging in there with the 16GB card, but a couple percentage short. But again, these aren't exactly the same graphics card physically, so sometimes a couple percent difference is just the difference between the two cooler models, and they're boosting differently, something like that. In 1440p medium settings, again, it's just a 1 FPS difference between the two card models, so I don't think there's anything VRAM related going on here. And again, you can kick on DLSS and get a high frame rate experience even on the 8GB card. Let's look at another game, so Ghost of Tsushima. Not a super graphically demanding game or anything like that, but can look nice. And here they have exactly the same averages, small difference in the 1% lows. Again, there can just be some run-to-run variance, and like I said, not exactly physically the same graphics card. But if you look at the 16 gigabyte card, it is allocating above 8 gigabytes of VRAM, even if it's not reporting that in the per process usage. So potentially there's something going on there with that 1% load differential. Medium settings, things are a little bit closer together in the 1% lows, although the 8 gigabyte card is still a little bit lower than the 16, but they are exactly tied in the averages. I'm not seeing any major issues on the frame time graph or anything, so I think this one's fine on the 8 gigabyte card. At 1440p, very high settings, again, performing pretty much identically here, so not a lot to say. And then you could kick on DLSS quality on that as well to get higher frame rates. Now, I also tested out medium settings to be thorough here, and again, the medium settings, the cards perform pretty similarly. Again, small difference in the 1% lows, but I'm not seeing major issues on the 8 gigabyte card's frame time graph or anything, so I don't think it's anything to be too worried about. And you can do medium settings with DLSS quality, and again, extremely minor differences between the two cards. I don't think it's VRAM related. Let's look at, so what if you're just playing esports games though? Because honestly, I think this is the main argument for 8 gigabyte cards being okay for some people, is if you're mostly playing low settings, so here I'm looking at basic settings to get a higher frame rate and like declutter the environments and things like that for a competitive advantage. So if you mostly play competitive games where you always turn the settings down to low, well, then you're not likely going to be having 8 gigabyte VRAM issues, and performance will be just fine on that card. So there is that. Again, 1440p basic settings, the cards are performing roughly the same. No sign that there's a VRAM related issue on either of them. And again, you could even kick on DLSS and boost frame rates further. I think that's all the tests that I ran here, so pop out a little bit for some final thoughts. So the overall point of this video is to get an honest look at what it's like with an 8 gigabyte graphics card in 2025. So again, there are people who say that it's an absolute disaster, games will literally just crash and not even run on an 8 gigabyte card, and there are people who say that it is absolutely fine, what are you guys whining about? And I think part of that is people's experiences, what they choose to do with the graphics card can be different. Like I said, if you're just playing the esports titles turned down to low settings, then yeah, you're probably gonna get by just fine on the 8 gigabyte card. If you're playing the latest, AAA graphically demanding stuff at highest or near the highest graphic settings, 8 gigabytes is gonna be a disaster. But what we're starting to see is that more and more games, even at like medium settings and even at 1080p medium settings, are starting to show issues on the 8 gigabyte card. It's just we're starting to get further and further beyond the point where 8 gigabyte graphics cards are just fine for 1080p, or just tweak the settings down a little bit and then you'll never have an issue. That certainly isn't true anymore. So I guess what I'd say is if you already have an 8 gigabyte graphics card and it's still playing the games you're playing just fine, and maybe you can turn down your graphic settings and have an okay experience, I'm not saying that somebody who already has an 8 gigabyte graphics card needs to immediately abandon it because it's a disaster. That's not what I'm saying. That's never been the intention of any of these videos. What I am saying though is, if you're buying a new graphics card in 2025, and again, the 5060 Ti is rumored to be coming out with an 8 gigabyte version at $379, so almost $400, I would say that that is a very questionable decision, right? So that's really the issue. It's not that you can't play games on an 8 gigabyte card anymore, but you do have to worry about the graphic settings a lot more than somebody who has enough VRAM. But you can get by with it. The issue is spending almost $400 on a new graphics card in 2025 that only has 8 gigabytes of VRAM, because we've been seeing the situation there getting worse and worse and worse, and that's not going to be getting better. It's going to continue to be getting worse. So a lot of people hold on to their graphics cards for a number of years, especially with graphics card advancement seeming to slow down. You might be holding on to your graphics card for longer than ever, unless you buy the 8 gigabyte version, because then I think you're going to be more likely to see issues coming soon. All right, that's what I've got for you guys today. Again, it's basically the fact that there's truth to what everybody says about the 8GB cards. You can make games work fine on them, but there's also a lot of games that don't work fine. And oftentimes you do have to go below medium settings to get it to work fine, even though there are definitely games that are working perfectly okay. Again, it is going to be causing you problems and things to think about. So I wouldn't recommend spending almost $400 on a brand new 8GB graphics card in 2025 if that is indeed what we end up seeing, if the rumors be true. I hope all of you found the video useful and or interesting. Huge thank you to viewers, subscribers, channel members who click the join button to directly support the channel financially. Huge thanks, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.